Chapter 15 of Gray Lensman by E. Smith. Chapter 15. Before the Dauntless was serviced for the flight into the unknown, Kinnison changed his mind. He was vaguely troubled about the trip. It was nothing as definite as a hunch. Hunches are, the Gray Lensman knew, the result of the operation of an extrasensory perception possessed by all of us in greater or lesser degree. It was probably not an obscure warning to his supersense from another, more pervasive dimension. It was, he thought, a repercussion of the doubt in Ecliptic's mind that the fading out of the men's bodies had been due to simple invisibility. "I think I'd better go alone, Chief," he informed the port admiral one day. "I'm not quite as sure as I was as to just what they've got." "What difference does that make?" Haines demanded. "Lives," was the terse reply. "Your life is what I'm thinking about. You'll be safer with the big ship, you can't deny that." "Well, perhaps, but I don't want—" "What you want is immaterial." "How about a compromise? I'll take Worzel and Van Buskirk. When the overlords hypnotized him that time, it made Bus so mad that he's been taking treatments from Worzel. Nobody can hypnotize him now, Worzel says, not even an overlord." "No compromise. I can't order you to take the Dauntless, since your authority is transcendent. You can take anything you like. I can, however, and shall, order the Dauntless to ride your tail wherever you go." "QX, I'll have to take her then." Kinnison's voice grew somber. "But suppose half the crew don't get back, and that I do? Isn't that what happened on the Britannia?" "No," came flat answer. "We were all taking the same chance then. It was the luck of the draw. This is different." "How different?" "I've got better equipment than they have. I'd be a murderer, cold." "Not at all. No more than then. You had better equipment then, too, you know, although not as much of it. Every commander of men has that same feeling when he sends men to death. But put yourself in my place. Would you send one of your best men, or let him go alone on a highly dangerous mission when more men or ships would improve his chances? Answer that honestly." "Probably I wouldn't," Kinnison admitted reluctantly. "QX, take all the precautions you can, but I don't have to tell you that. I know you will." Therefore, it was the Dauntless in which Kinnison set out a day or two later. With him were Worzel and Van Buskirk, as well as the vessel's full operating crew of Tellurians. As they approached the region of space in which Ecliptic's vessel had been attacked, every man of the crew got his armor in readiness for instant use, checked his sidearms, and took his emergency battle station. Kinnison turned then to Worzel. "How do you feel, fellow old snake?" he asked. "Scared," the Valancian replied, sending a rippling surge of power the full length of the 30-foot-long cable of supple, although almost steel-hard flesh that was his body. "Scared to the tip of my tail. Not that they can treat me as they did before. We three, at least, are safe from their minds. But at what they will do. Whatever it is to be, it will not be what we expect. They certainly will not do the obvious." "That's what's clogging my jets," the Lensman agreed. "As a flapper told me once, I'm getting the screaming memes." "That's what you mugs get for being so brainy," Van Buskirk put in. With a flick of his massive wrist, he brought his 30-pound space axe to the ready as lightly as though it were a Tellurian dress saber. "Bring on your overlords. Squish, just like that." And a whistling sweep of his atrocious weapon was illustration enough. "Maybe something in that, too, Bus," he laughed. Then to the Valancian, "About time to tune in one of them, I guess." He was in no doubt whatever as to Worzel's ability to reach them. He knew that that incredibly powerful mind, without lens or advanced Arisian instruction, had been able to cover 11 solar systems. He knew that, with his present ability, Worzel could cover half of space. Although every fiber of his being shrieked protest against contact with the hereditary foe of his race, the Valancian put his mind en rapport with the overlords and sent out his thought. He listened for seconds, motionless. then glided across the room to the thought-screened pilot and hissed directions. The pilot altered his course sharply and gave her the gun. "I'll take her over now," Warsaw said presently. "It'll look better that way, more as though they had us all under control." He cut the Bergenholm, then set everything on 0. The ship hung, inert and practically motionless, in space. Simultaneously, 20 unscreened men, volunteers, dashed toward the main airlock, overcome by some intense emotion. "Now! Screens on! Scramblers!" Kinnison yelled. And at his words, a thought screen enclosed the ship. High-powered scramblers, within whose fields no invisibility apparatus could hold, burst into action. Then the vessel was right beside the Dauntless, a Boskonian in every line and member. "Fire!" But even as she appeared, before a firing stud could be pressed, the enemy aircraft almost disappeared again. Or rather, she did not really appear at all, except as the veriest wraith of what a good solid ship of space alloy ought to be. She was a ghost ship, as unsubstantial as fog. Mist, tenuous, immaterial, the shadow of a shadow. A dream ship built of the gossamer of dreams, manned by figments of horror recruited from sheerest nightmare. Not invisibility this time, Kinnison knew with a profound shock. Something else. Something entirely different. Something utterly incomprehensible. Ixclippic had said it as nearly as it could be put into understandable words. The Boskonian ship was leaving, although it was standing still. It was monstrous. It couldn't be done. Then, at a range of only feet instead of the usual point-blank range of hundreds of miles, the tremendous secondaries of the Dauntless cut loose. At such a ridiculous range as that, why, the screens themselves kept anything further away from them than that ship was. They couldn't miss. Nor did they. But neither did they hit. Those ravening beams went through and through the tenuous fabrication, which should have been a vessel, but they struck nothing whatever. They went past, entirely harmlessly past, both the ship itself and the wraith-like but unforgettable figures which Kinnison recognized at a glance as overlords of Delgon. His heart sank with a thud. He knew when he had had enough, and this was altogether too much. "Go free," he rasped. "Give her the oof." Energy poured into and through the great Bergenholm, but nothing happened. Ship and contents remained inert. Not exactly inert either, for the men were beginning to feel a new and unique sensation. Energy raved from the driving jets, but still nothing happened. There was none of the thrust, none of the reaction of an inert start. There was none of the lashing, quivering awareness of speed which affects every mind, however hardened to free flight, in the instant of change from rest to motion, many times faster than that of light. Armor, thought screens, emergency stations all. Since they could not run away from whatever it was that was coming, they would face it. And something was happening now. There was no doubt of that. Kinnison had been seasick and airsick and spacesick. Also, since cadets must learn to be able to do without artificial gravity, pseudo-inertia, and those other refinements which make space liners so comfortable, he had known the nausea and the queasily terrifying, endless fall sensations of weightlessness, as well as the even worse outrages of the sensibilities incident to inertialessness in its crudest, most basic applications. He thought that he was familiar with all the untoward sensations of every mode of travel known to science. This, however, was something entirely new. He felt as though he were being compressed, not as a whole, but atom by atom. He was being twisted, corkscrewed, in a monstrously obscure fashion, which permitted him neither to move from his place nor to remain where he was. He hung there, poised, for hours, or was it for a thousandth of a second? At the same time he felt a painless but revolting transformation progress in a series of waves throughout his entire body. A rearrangement, a writhing, crawling distortion, an incomprehensibly impossible extrusion of each ultimate corpuscle of his substance in an unknowable and non-existent direction. As slowly or as rapidly as the transformation had waxed, it waned. He was again free to move. As far as he could tell, everything was almost as before. The Dauntless was about the same, so was the almost invisible ship attached to her so closely. There was, however, a difference. The air seemed thick. Familiar objects were seen blurrily, dimly, distorted. Outside the ship there was nothing except a vague blur of grayness, no stars, no constellations. A wave of thought came beating into his brain. He had to leave the Dauntless. It was most vitally important to go into that dimly seen companion vessel without an instant's delay. And even as his mind instinctively reared a barrier, blocking out the intruding thought, he recognized it for what it was, the summons of the overlords. But how about the thought screens, he thought in a semi-daze. Then reason resumed accustomed sway. He was no longer in space, at least not in the space he knew. That new indescribable sensation had been one of acceleration. When they attained constant velocity, it stopped. Acceleration, velocity, in what? To what? He did not know. Out of space, he knew it, certainly. Time was distorted, unrecognizable. Matter did not necessarily obey the familiar laws. Thought? QX, thought lying in the sub-ether, probably was unaffected. Thought screen generators, however, being material, might not, in fact, did not work. Worcel, Van Buskirk, and he did not need them, but those other poor devils. He looked at them. The men, all of them, officers and all, had thrown off their armor, thrown away their weapons, and were again rushing toward the lock. With a smothered curse, Kinnison followed them, as did the Valantian and the giant Dutch Valerian. Into the lock, through it, into the almost invisible space tube, which, he noticed, was floored with a much denser appearing substance. The air felt heavy, dense, like water, or even more like metallic mercury. It breathed, however, QX. Into the Boskonian ship, along corridors, into a room which was precisely such a torture chamber as Kinnison had described. There they were, 10 of them, 10 of the dragon-like reptilian overlords of Delgon. They moved slowly, sluggishly, as did the Tellurians, in that thick, dense medium which was not, could not be, air. 10 chains were thrown, like pictures in slow motion, about 10 human necks. 10 entranced men were led unresistingly to anguished doom. This time the Gray Lensman's curse was not smothered. With a blistering deep space oath, he pulled his delameter and fired once, twice, thrice. No soap. He knew it, but he had to try. Furiously he launched himself. His taloned fingers, ravening to tear, went past, not around, the overlord's throat, and the scimitarred tail of the reptile, fierce-driven, apparently went through the lensman, screens, armor, and brisket, but touched none of them in passing. He hurled a thought, a more disastrous bolt by far than he had sent against any mind since he had learned the art. In vain. The overlords, themselves masters of mentality, could not be slain or even swerved by any forces at his command. Kinnison reared back then in thought. There must be some ground, some substance common to the planes or dimensions involved, else they could not be here. The deck, for instance, was as solid to his feet as it was to the enemy. He thrust out a hand at the wall beside him. It was not there. The chains, however, held his suffering men, and the overlords held the chains, the knives also, and the clubs, and the other implements of torture being wielded with such peculiarly horrible slowness. To think was to act. He leaped forward, seized a maul, and made as though to swing it in a terrific blow, only to stop, shocked. The maul did not move, or rather it moved, but so slowly, as though he were hauling it through putty. He dropped the handle, shoving it back, and received another shock, for it kept on coming under the urge of his first mighty heave. Kept coming, knocking him aside as it came. Mass, inertia. The stuff must be 100 times as dense as platinum. Bus, he flashed a thought to the staring Valerian. Grab one of those clubs here, a little one. Even you can't swing a big one. And get to work. As he thought, he leaped again, this time for a small, slender knife, almost a scalpel, but with a long, keenly thin blade. Even though it was massive as a dozen broadswords, he could swing it, and he did so, plunging lethally as he swung. A full arm sweep, razor edge shearing, crunching through plated, corded throat, grisly head floating one way, horrid body the other. Then an attack in waves of his own men. The overlords knew what was toward. They commanded their slaves to abate the nuisance, and the Gray Lensman was buried under an avalanche of furious, although unharmed, humanity. "Chase 'em off me, will you, Warsaw?" Kinnison pleaded. "You're husky enough to handle 'em all. I'm not. Hold 'em off while Bus and I polish off this crowd, huh?" And Warsaw did so. Van Buskirk, scorning Kinnison's advice, had seized the biggest thing in sight, only to relinquish it sheepishly. He might as well have attempted to wield a bridge girder. He finally selected a tiny bar, only half an inch in diameter and scarcely 6 feet long, but he found that even this sliver was more of a bludgeon than any space axe he had ever swung. Then the armed pair went joyously to war, the Tellurian with his knife, the Valerian with his magic wand. When the overlords saw that a fight to the finish was inevitable, they also seized weapons and fought with the desperation of the cornered rats they were. This, however, freed Warsaw from guard duty, since the monsters were fully occupied in defending themselves. He seized a length of chain, wrapped 6 feet of tail in an unbreakable anchorage around a torture rack, and set viciously to work. Thus again the intrepid three, the only minions of civilization theretofore to have escaped alive from the clutches of the overlords of Delgon, fought side by side. Van Buskirk, particularly, was in his element. He was used to a gravity almost 3 times Earth's. He was accustomed to enormously heavy, almost vicious air. This stuff, thick as it was, tasted infinitely better than the vacuum that Tellurians like to breathe. It let a man use his strength. And the gigantic Dutchman waded in happily, swinging his frightfully massive weapon with devastating effect. Crunch! Splash! Thwack! When that bar struck, it did not stop. It went through. Blood, brains, smashed heads, and dismembered limbs flying in all directions. And Warsaw's lethal chain, driven irresistibly at the end of the 20-foot lever of his free length of body, clanked, hummed, and snarled its way through reptilian flesh. And while Kinnison was puny indeed in comparison with his 2 brothers-in-arms, he had selected a weapon which would make his skill count, and his wicked knife stabbed, sheared, and stringently bit. And thus, instead of dealing out death, the overlords died. End of chapter 15.